I want to take just a moment so that this is on our video. I'll be in England the next 2 Sundays, and they probably will not have the ability to put that up on video. But David Ketchum's speaking here, and I have never heard David Ketchum speak that I didn't learn something that I really needed to know. So please do continue to tune in the next 2 weeks while I am away. And if you just think you're going to die, I will post the text of my lectures in England on our church's website. If you can find spfccc.org and just click on the sermon button, I'll have the text of those lectures up there. Fair enough? David, do you want to say anything about? Okay. Well, this has been quite a week in America. The first of what could be called the #MeToo movement convictions finally came down. Bill Cosby, who was once thought of as America's dad, a black actor and comedian that I literally grew up listening to his comedy albums, watched some of his cartoons, enjoyed his TV shows. But he was convicted of multiple counts of sexual assault, and there were a bunch more that could have been convictions if the time hadn't run out. It took 40 years to chase him into the courtroom and actually get this trial. It took 2 trials, and the sentencing is yet to be held, but it's likely that this 80-year-old icon will spend the rest of his life in prison. Now, I heard the news with a very odd combination of relief and sadness. It would have been horrible if he had managed to translate his fame, his money, his popularity, or even his age into some kind of escape from judgment. And yet it hardly seemed like something to celebrate. I hate that these crimes happened. I hate that he convinced himself generations ago that it was okay to treat women in this way. And I hate that he has now destroyed whatever positive influences that he may have had. And I understand there was some bifurcated feelings about the way in which he's tried to shame a lot of black culture and things. So he wasn't universally loved, but he did try to accomplish a number of good things, and all of that is now under a huge cloud because of these horrible sex crimes that he committed. I hope that today his victims feel that they have been heard. I hope this offers them some sense of support, some healing, some hope for the future. But you know, folks, there's no way to unring a bell. When something this horrible has happened, there is no undoing it. But Cosby's victims have also been denied one thing that I think they deserve and that surely would have helped. And that would be if he could have shown some remorse, if he could have just apologized for these things that he did. Now, it was a much less serious crime, but there's been another controversy stirring this week around one of MSNBC's rising stars in broadcast journalism. Joy Reid has become one of the most credible, one of the most watched television journalists in recent months. But she just very recently suffered from a revelation that she had posted some absolutely homophobic, mean, horrible things on a blog a few years ago, but some of them were not that long ago. And her initial reaction to it was to say that her account had been hacked and that someone else had written those things. But she thought better of it and said simply that she found it hard to recognize the person who had written those things. But she acknowledged that that was who she was. It's not who she is now. She would never say those things now. She doesn't believe those things. She doesn't feel those things. But she was the person who wrote those horrible things. And in a courageous and possibly career-saving move, she invited several members of the LGBTQ community to become a panel on her Saturday morning show yesterday. And she profusely and sincerely apologized. And then she sat there and took their reprimands. Now, the panel was largely pretty kind to her, giving her permission to both apologize and to change, but they also didn't pull punches. It was not an easy thing. She was humiliated, but as they say, sunshine is often the best antiseptic. She did what she needed to do, which was to be honest about her offenses. She asked for forgiveness. And, you know, no one person can forgive you for the gay community. You know, no one is like the queen of lesbians, you know, that can just say what you said was okay. But she has at least asked for forgiveness, and she'll get it in some quarters, and in some quarters she won't. She will wear the scars from having said what she said. But at least for me, she also gains the credibility that comes from honest confession. And I have to say, unlike one of her peers on MSNBC, Chris Matthews, I've heard repeatedly say that he was one of the only journalists in the early years who publicly opposed the invasion of Iraq. Well, folks, he didn't. In fact, he said that if George Bush pulls off this invasion of Iraq, that his bust should be added to Mount Rushmore. That's what he said at the time. Now, he's denied it so many times that he appears to actually believe it himself. But sadly, for people in his profession, any of you can just look it up on YouTube. Just look up Chris Matthews and Mount Rushmore, and you get to see where he said that George W. Bush should be on Mount Rushmore. This kind of dishonesty is what is wrong with journalism. You can make mistakes and you can correct them, but lying about it does not have any honor. Now, I believe that I could safely defend everything that I have said about the LGBTQ civil rights issues over the past 25 years. But I'm 61 years old, and I don't want to be reminded of what I might have said 30 years ago. I can't confidently say that I am now woke. I hope I am. But I know for a fact that 30 years ago I wasn't. I have changed enough that I have actually thrown away all the sermons that I wrote in the first 25 years that I was in ministry. And I'm not sure that I would want to defend everything that I said 7 or 8 years ago. I don't believe what I used to believe. I am not who I used to be. And I'm really, really glad that I've been serving a church for the past 10 years that has allowed me to change, has allowed me to grow. And I can't thank you enough for both tolerating and encouraging me to figure out what this progressive spiritual path is like. I thank you from the bottom of my heart. And you know, every other church that you've ever been to would have fired me for any one of the sermons that you've heard. So thank you. Thank you. Well, thank you. Seriously. Oh. Hey, every time I drive up, I'm still surprised my name's on the sign out front. I'm glad to be here. But it isn't just me that has changed. You know, the world has changed, and right now is changing very rapidly. There was never a world at any time where it was okay to do what Cosby did, of drugging women and having sex with them when they were unconscious. But there was a world in which women were discouraged from talking about it. They were told not to tell their story. And sometimes they were paid off, and in out-of-court settlements, they had to sign non-disclosure agreements. Sometimes they were paid off with jobs. This is what the whole casting couch thing was about, that they suffered terrible humiliation and abuse, and they were rewarded with a job. Sometimes they were threatened with lawsuits or with physical violence. That, thankfully, is changing. Victims are much more often being given the opportunity to tell their stories now. And this can be dangerous stuff because not every story is true, and not everyone will be able to substantiate their story. But there are other issues. A couple of recent internet memes have tried to shine a little sunlight on the faltering progress that we're making. 50 or 60 women can feel some relief with the conviction of Bill Cosby, maybe 80 or more. But there are at least 20 women who are still waiting for the world to be willing to hear their stories of Donald Trump's manipulation, payoffs, and at least in one case, child rape. Power and money still mean way too much in our court system. And we cannot escape the fact that as much as we may feel some justice in the case of Bill Cosby, we can't help but notice that other rapists, manipulators, liars, and misogynists who are white rich men have not yet gone to court. And I just don't see how that could be true. It's 2018. Can it be that race still plays this much of a role in our judicial system? It reminds me of this famous scene from Casablanca when Captain Renault, after years of taking bribes from the casino, announces loudly, "I'm shocked that there is gambling going on in this establishment." Now, we are progressives here, which means that we hope for progress, right? I mean, that's all that can mean. I believe that we are making progress, but folks, Rome wasn't built in a day. But we should remember that it burned down in a day. And if we don't make some real progress on this front related to race and gender, we might need to buy Nero a fiddle. I often think of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa. After years of violent enforcement of apartheid, there was a reasonable fear that if they ever disassembled apartheid, that the black majority population might turn on the white population and kill all of them, because they had it coming. There have been so many unspeakable violations of their human and civil rights. But in setting up the commission, Bishop Desmond Tutu, who I think should go on a short list of modern saints, said, "Forgiving and being reconciled to our enemies or our loved ones are not about pretending that things are other than what they are. It's not about patting one another on the back and turning a blind eye to the wrong. True reconciliation exposes the awfulness, the abuse, the hurt, the truth. It could even sometimes make things worse. It's a risky undertaking, but in the end, it is worthwhile. Because in the end, only an honest confrontation with reality can bring about real healing. Superficial reconciliation can bring only superficial healing." Now, I tell people a lot that if someone has hurt you, offended you, abused you in some way, and they're never going to apologize, that you have to make a decision about how much space in your skull you're going to rent to that memory. How much of that is going to stay alive for you? How much is that going to control you and define who you are and your future? Because a lot of times you have to move on without any satisfaction at all. But I want to say this, and there's only 50 or 60 of us here, but another 15,000 folks are going to join us online. And I want to say to everybody in the sound of my voice, if you sexually assaulted, raped, inappropriately touched, took advantage of an underage person at any time in your life, you need to take responsibility and go to your victim and tell them that you're sorry. Now, maybe you can't afford to lose your family. Maybe you can't afford potential legal entanglements, but I can tell you, depending on your victims to forget about it, or to say that was 10 years ago, that was 15 years ago, that was 20 years ago, that's baloney. That is no way to deal with it. Pretending that it didn't happen is unhealthy for you, and it is unjust to your victims. There's not a lot about Dietrich Bonhoeffer's theology that I want to carry forward into the 21st century. It was really kind of pretty conservative. But when he said that forgiveness without confession is cheap grace, I'm all on that. If you believe that you should be forgiven through amnesia, you're nuts. The only way that you can be forgiven is to acknowledge the horribleness of what you did. And folks, some crimes are theft, some crimes are violence, some crimes are sexual assault. But if you ever tell yourself that there was a kid that was asking for it, or they're partly to blame, or they seduced you, you're lying to yourself, and you need to stop it right now. You need to own what you did and apologize to your victim. Now, I hope victims can get healthy without it, because not many people are going to have the courage to own it. But don't expect forgiveness through forgetting. They are not the same thing. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission offered the brilliant and spiritually profound opportunity for the guilty to publicly acknowledge what they did and to escape criminal prosecution. And many of them richly deserved criminal prosecution. But they were forgiven for their crimes by acknowledging what they had done wrong and pledging not to do it again. And that hasn't been perfect. South Africa is still one of the only countries in the world that's got more gun violence than America. But there wasn't the bloodbath that we feared. And this may not make me very popular to say, but like Chris Matthews, I'm going to say it, and I'll have no way to hide from this comment in the future because it'll be online forever. But I personally feel terrible cognitive dissonance whenever I'm in a meeting and I am expected to stand for the national anthem or to repeat the Pledge of Allegiance to the American flag. I don't pledge allegiance to empires. I don't, even if I'm a citizen of that empire, because empires always defend economic exploitation. Empires always seem to defend institutional racism and militarism. Now, I believe I'm patriotic because I want my country to be a great country, but I will not pretend that I consent to evil, even when it's domestic evil. Or maybe I should say, especially when it's domestic evil. When it's my country that is guilty of these crimes, I'm not going to pretend like I pledge unwavering allegiance, because I don't. Amen. Thanks. And while the first verse of our national anthem is thrilling and triumphant, I know that its author was a terrible pro-slavery racist. And in the third verse of the Battle Hymn of the Republic, he assures slaves and indentured servants that they will go to the grave before they ever get free. And in fact, if I had time to go into the weeds, much of the real motivation behind our Second Amendment was to make sure that slave owners were armed against a revolt from their slaves, who often outnumbered them. All of which makes Colin Kaepernick's decision to just kneel during the singing of the national anthem, boy, that seems mild. He and all other American blacks have every reason to speak their minds, not just about current police violence, but about 300 years of slavery and economic oppression. I personally would say that I'm boycotting football from now on for the way that they've treated Colin Kaepernick, but I've never watched a football game, so it's kind of an empty threat. But I don't wonder why Colin Kaepernick knelt during the Battle Hymn of the Republic. I wonder why there's a black person standing on the field while it's being played. And frankly, if there's any white folk that are woke, I don't know what they're doing there. Because the hymn is a pledge to black people that will bury you before you ever get your rights. And I think Arlo Guthrie's, or his dad, what was Arlo Guthrie's dad? Woody Guthrie's, This Land Is My Land. I think that would be a better national anthem. That's just my opinion, and I just so happen to be right. But a lot of what we've heard is people saying to athletes that a sporting event is the wrong time for you to tell your story. And they say to the victims of homophobic hate speech or of sexual assault that this is not the time, this is not the place for you to tell your story. And the kids at the Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School were being told this is not the time for you to talk about gun control. And I want to quote them because I think they've narrowed it down to the most poignant response. BS. It is always time to tell your story. As the author Anne Lamott has said, you own everything that's happened to you. Tell your stories. If people wanted you to write warmly about them, they should have behaved better. We cannot rid the world of injustice, but we can make the decision that we're always going to come down on the side of the truth. We here, we are in the truth-telling business. We cannot unring the bell of our history of sexual and racial injustice, but as Martin Luther King Jr. said, darkness cannot drive out darkness. Only light can do that. Hate cannot drive out hate. Only love can do that. Now, we can't fix everything, but this much I do know. Telling victims to be quiet, telling them that the time is not right or this is not the right place, only means that healing never happens and the wound only festers. We are in the truth-telling business, not to be mean, not to be vindictive or punitive, but to open the door to healing. Hate does not drive out hatred. Only love can do that. And aren't we in the love business? Amen.
Thank you for watching our videos. We are entirely dependent on the donations of our listeners and members. We hope that you find this content to be important enough to help us to keep offering these videos to the public at no charge by becoming a regular contributor. Please click on the donate button on our website at www.spfccc.org. Thank you for your support of progressive religious programming.